The late morning air was crisp, laced with the faint scent of cut grass and dew. Birds chirped softly in the distance, their sounds barely audible over the slow crunch of gravel beneath Margaret Whitmore's polished black heels. The cemetery was silent, serene even, the kind of silence that pressed against the chest and wrapped tightly around the heart. It was the one place where Margaret, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women on the East Coast, allowed herself to feel anything other than control. Each year, without fail, Margaret came to this place. The rest of the world only saw her as the stoic CEO of Whitmore Industries, a woman of steel nerves, designer suits, and unrelenting ambition. But here, before the grave of her only son Nathaniel, she was just a mother, a grieving, broken mother who had never truly recovered from the phone call that changed her life forever. It had been 5 years. 5 long years since the accident. Nathaniel had been 26, brilliant, charismatic, and full of promise. He was supposed to take over the company, to carry the Whitmore name into a new era. But all of that had disappeared in an instant, on a rainy highway just outside Boston. They told her it was a head-on collision. Drunk driver. No survivors. Since then, the world hadn't felt the same. The mansion was too quiet. The office too cold. No matter how much money she poured into charities or how many awards she accepted on his behalf, the ache never dulled. As Margaret stepped closer to the grave, clutching a fresh bouquet of white roses in one gloved hand, she saw something, or rather, someone, that made her pause mid-step. There was a woman kneeling by Nathaniel's headstone. Young, perhaps in her late 20s, with deep brown skin and her curly hair pulled back into a tight bun. She wore a plain black waitress uniform, frayed at the sleeves, as though she'd come straight from a shift. Her back was to Margaret, but her body was racked with sobs, trembling as if something inside her had broken. Beside the woman stood a small boy. Maybe 4 or 5 years old. He clutched a worn teddy bear in one hand and stared silently at the gravestone, his white eyes full of questions no child should ever have to ask. His other hand rested gently on the woman's arm, as if offering support far beyond his years. Margaret blinked. Her instinct was to turn away, to allow them their privacy. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, rooted her to the spot. There was something painfully familiar about the way the boy's brow furrowed as he looked at the grave. And the woman's voice, though muffled by grief, had a soft lilt that carried more weight than the words themselves. She heard her whisper, "I'm sorry, Nathaniel. I'm so sorry we weren't enough to keep you here." The name hit Margaret like a slap. Not your father, not your friend, not even him, but Nathaniel. Her son. Margaret's fingers tightened around the bouquet, and she stepped forward, her footsteps no longer masked by the gravel. The woman turned at the sound, her eyes red and puffy, but alert. For a moment, their eyes locked, Margaret's cold and confused, the woman's filled with a mix of fear and recognition. "I'm sorry," the woman said quickly, rising to her feet. "I didn't know anyone else would be here." "You knew my son?" Margaret asked, her voice level, but edged with something she couldn't quite identify. The woman hesitated. She looked down at the boy, then back at Margaret. "Yes, I did." Margaret's heart, usually a fortress of iron, skipped a beat. She took a closer look at the child. The way his eyes were slightly almond-shaped, the way his lips curled when he was thinking. A chill ran down her spine. "What's your name?" she asked the woman. The woman swallowed hard. "Jasmine. Jasmine Hayes." And the boy. Another pause. Jasmine's hands instinctively moved to the child's shoulders. "This is Elijah." "Elijah," Margaret repeated softly, as if tasting the name for the first time. He's very handsome." "Thank you. How did you know Nathaniel?" Margaret's voice was firmer now, but still careful. Jasmine looked down at her feet. "I don't think this is the right place to talk about that." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I think it's exactly the right place. My son is buried here, and you're standing over his grave crying with a child who looks," she stopped herself, but the implication hung thick in the air. "I worked at a diner," Jasmine said quietly, eyes still downcast. 5 years ago. In Cambridge. Your son, he used to come in a lot." Margaret said nothing. "He was kind," Jasmine continued. "Funny. Nothing like I expected someone of his background to be. He used to sit at the back table and talk to me for hours if I wasn't too busy. Some days he'd bring books. Other times he'd just listen. I was going through a lot. He helped me more than he ever knew." The woman's voice cracked, and she took a breath to steady herself. One night, after my shift, we walked by the Charles River. It started raining, but we didn't care. We just kept walking and talking. And then, she trailed off, her eyes flickering toward Elijah. Margaret understood. You're telling me that she looked down at the boy again, her expression unreadable. Jasmine nodded slowly. I didn't know I was pregnant until after the accident. I didn't try to contact anyone. I didn't think I had the right. Margaret took a step back, as though the world was tilting beneath her feet. Her lips parted, but no words came. Elijah, still clutching his bear, looked up at her. Are you Nana? He asked innocently. Jasmine turned pale. Margaret looked at him, stunned. What did you say? The boy repeated, are you Nana? Mommy showed me pictures of Daddy, and she said maybe one day I could meet his mommy too. Margaret's hand trembled as she pressed it to her chest. She stared at the boy's face, and for the first time, the sharp walls of grief she had built over 5 long years began to crack. She had not just lost a son, she had lost a grandson she never knew existed. A piece of Nathaniel still alive, breathing, right in front of her. I didn't mean for you to find out this way, Jasmine said, her voice choked. I bring him here sometimes. To talk to Nathaniel. To tell him about school, or drawings he made, or how he misses him. He deserves to know his father. Margaret was silent, her eyes filled with something far more dangerous than anger, regret. Elijah stepped forward, offering his teddy bear to her with a child's trusting heart. Daddy's your boy, right? Mommy says he's in heaven. I talk to him when we come here. Margaret knelt slowly, her knees weak. She wasn't used to bending for anyone. But she did now. She gently took the bear, her eyes meeting Elijah's. Yes, Nathaniel was my boy. He smiled. Then maybe you're my Nana. Something deep inside her broke. For the first time in years, the tears came. Not the single tear she allowed each anniversary, not the controlled sadness she wore like a well-fitted coat. But real, raw, human tears. She reached out, wrapping her arms around Elijah. He didn't flinch. He leaned into her, as if something in his tiny heart had already accepted her. Behind them, Jasmine stood still, watching with a mixture of fear and hope, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake or the most important decision of her life. Margaret looked up at her, still holding Elijah close. You should have told me, she whispered. I was scared, Jasmine replied. Honestly, I didn't know what kind of woman you were. I didn't know if you'd want him. Margaret looked down at the child who was now tracing the pearls around her neck with innocent fascination. I want him, she said softly. I want to know him. A silence settled over the graveyard, not heavy like before, but lighter. Like something long buried was finally beginning to rise. In that moment, surrounded by stone, silence, and loss, Margaret realized she hadn't come to mourn today. She had come to find something she didn't know she'd lost. And she had found it, in the eyes of a little boy who called her Nana. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. The soft ticking of the antique clock on her bedroom wall, usually a comforting background noise, now echoed like thunder through her mind. Her silk sheets offered no comfort, and the soft mattress that usually cradled her into a deep slumber felt stiff and foreign. She had a grandson, a real, breathing, laughing child. And she hadn't known. That boy, Elijah, had looked up at her with those curious golden brown eyes and called her, Nana, without hesitation. As if he had been waiting his whole life to meet her. Nathaniel had a son. Her son had been a father. The reality was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because she had a piece of him back. A curse because she had missed the first 5 years of that child's life. First steps, first words, first days of school. She missed all of it. And no amount of money or regret could rewind time. She spent the entire night turning those thoughts over in her mind, from anger to sorrow to guilt. Guilt, mostly. Guilt for not knowing. Guilt for not pushing harder when she suspected Nathaniel had secrets. He had always been the golden boy, the charming one, but he also had that hidden side, quiet, reflective, secretive. He had distanced himself from her in those final years. She had assumed it was rebellion, maybe resentment, maybe just youth. But now she realized it was something else. It was love, a love he had chosen to keep hidden from the world. From her. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the grand windows of her penthouse, she sat alone in the sunroom with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her assistant, Martin, a man as punctual and composed as the finely pressed suit he wore, stood near the door with a digital tablet in hand. "Your schedule for the day, ma'am," he said politely. Margaret didn't even look up. "Cancel everything." Martin blinked, surprised. "Ma'am." She finally lifted her head. Her eyes were tired but resolute. "Everything. Meetings, calls, luncheons. Clear the entire week." Martin nodded slowly, well trained not to question her decisions. "Very well, Mrs. Whitmore." After he left the room, Margaret picked up the phone and stared at it. She hadn't taken Jasmine's number the day before. But she was Margaret Whitmore. Information was power, and finding someone wasn't difficult when you had the right tools. With a few phone calls to her private investigator, she had a full report on Jasmine Hayes within the hour. Waitress. Lives in Roxbury. No criminal record. Single mother. Worked 2 jobs. No close family. The file even included photos of Jasmine walking Elijah to school, laughing as he showed her something on a piece of paper, probably a drawing. The candid shot of them together, so ordinary, so full of life, hit Margaret harder than she expected. There was love there, real and honest. And that boy, her grandson, was being raised with care and tenderness despite their circumstances. That afternoon, she had her driver take her to the address listed in the report. The house was small, tucked into a neighborhood that had seen better days. It had a sagging front porch, peeling paint, and an overgrown lawn, but there was a garden gnome by the steps and a faded rainbow chalk drawing on the sidewalk that read "Love lives here." She hesitated before getting out of the car. This wasn't her world. She wasn't used to being the one knocking on strangers' doors. But something bigger than pride pulled her forward. She rang the doorbell. A moment passed. Then another. The door finally opened a crack, revealing Jasmine's wary eyes. Her hair was in a messy bun, and she wore a loose t-shirt and pajama pants. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, not hiding her surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Margaret replied. "May I come in?" Jasmine looked hesitant. Her eyes flicked behind her, then back to Margaret. "Elijah's napping. I'll be quiet." There was a long pause. Then Jasmine opened the door wider and stepped aside. The inside of the house was modest but clean. A few toys scattered the living room. Crayon drawings were taped to the fridge in the open kitchen. A stack of children's books sat neatly on a side table. It was humble, but it felt like a home. Margaret stood awkwardly in the middle of the room. She had spent decades in polished boardrooms and luxury hotels, yet somehow, this tiny living room made her feel more exposed than ever. Jasmine offered her a seat on the couch, and she sat stiffly, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. "I hope I'm not intruding," Margaret said. "You are," Jasmine replied, then softened. "But it's okay. I figured I'd hear from you sooner or later." Margaret looked down. "I owe you an apology." Jasmine's eyebrows lifted. "For assuming, for doubting, for everything." Margaret sighed. "I didn't know. If I had." "I know," Jasmine said quietly. "That's why I never came to you. I didn't want Elijah to be treated like a mistake." Margaret looked up sharply. "He's not. I know that. But would you have believed me 5 years ago?" The truth was, probably not. Margaret had lived in a world of contracts and clauses, not feelings. She had been too proud, too suspicious, too blind to see beyond the surface. And Nathaniel had known that. Maybe that's why he kept Jasmine and Elijah hidden. "Why didn't Nathaniel tell me?" she asked finally. Jasmine smiled sadly. "Because he was afraid. He loved you, but he hated what your world expected of him. He said you'd never accept me. Not someone like me." Margaret felt a pang in her chest. He was wrong. Or maybe he was right at the time. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past thick in the air. "I didn't come here to take him from you," Margaret said. "I want to know him. I want to know both of you." Jasmine looked unsure. "He's never had anyone but me. I've protected him from a lot. I didn't want him to grow up feeling like he wasn't good enough." Margaret nodded. "Then let me help now. Please." Jasmine looked at her for a long time, searching her face, her intentions, her sincerity. Then a small voice called from down the hallway. "Mommy." Jasmine stood up. "He's awake." Elijah shuffled into the room in dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes. Margaret turned toward him, her heart catching in her throat. The boy blinked at her. "Hi." "Hello, sweetheart," Margaret said softly. He looked at his mother. "Is that the lady from the grave?" Jasmine nodded. "Yes, baby. That's Nana." Elijah lit up. "You came." Margaret felt the burn of tears in her eyes. "Yes, I came." He walked over and hugged her legs before she could even kneel. Without hesitation, without fear, Jasmine watched, something breaking inside her. She had built her life around keeping her son safe, but this moment, this tiny act of love, was proof that maybe, just maybe, he could have more than just survival. Maybe he could have family. Margaret stayed for hours that day. She read to Elijah. She listened to Jasmine's stories. She laughed for the first time in what felt like years. It wasn't long before she was invited to his preschool recital, then to a weekend trip to the aquarium. It all happened slowly, organically. They didn't trust her instantly. But she didn't push. She just showed up. And then one evening, Jasmine called her, frantic. "Elijah's sick. High fever. I don't know what's wrong. I can't reach his doctor." Margaret didn't hesitate. She sent her private physician to their house and met them there with a full medical team. It turned out to be the flu, but Margaret stayed up all night by his bedside with Jasmine, passing cold towels, whispering lullabies. That night changed something. Jasmine saw that Margaret wasn't just a billionaire trying to claim an heir. She was a grandmother, a mother, a woman with regrets, and a woman who was willing to fight for what mattered now. After Elijah recovered, Jasmine invited Margaret to dinner. A real dinner. At the same table where she and Elijah had shared countless meals alone. Margaret brought flowers. Not expensive roses from a boutique. Just wildflowers she picked from a roadside stand on the way. They talked. Really talked. About Nathaniel. About love. About how different their worlds were. About how maybe, if they tried, they could build a new one together for Elijah. Margaret offered to move them into one of her properties, just temporarily. Jasmine refused at first, proud and independent. But eventually, she agreed, on the condition that she kept working. She didn't want Elijah to grow up thinking money replaced effort. Margaret agreed. Weeks turned into months. They became a strange little family. Not perfect, not always easy, but real. Elijah started calling her Grandma Margaret. Sometimes just Nana. And one day, completely unprompted, he drew a picture of the three of them, holding hands, smiling in front of a house. On the top, he wrote, "My family." Margaret cried when she saw it. Not tears of guilt this time, but tears of healing, tears of hope.